Okay, so now that we've got that logo in, we're just going to set it aside. So again, I'm on my main cursor. I'm just going to click on this. I'm going to move it out here for now. And you can even see now it's even more pronounced, the little frames around those objects. Remembering that those are just they're guides around those shapes. They're literally the frames. They're not a color that's been applied to that. So when you see that, that's why we like to use that presentation mode so that we can avoid seeing things like that and all the guides and so on. InDesign is quite a busy program as you get working with it because there's so many guides and there's frames around everything and little symbols on frames that indicate one thing or another. So it can get pretty daunting when you just want to see how your design works. That's why that pressing W, the presentation mode, is so helpful. So I'm going to keep that out there. And I just want to mention that you can work in this space. This is actually referred to, I'll zoom out here. This is referred to as the paste board. So you can get things a little bit outside of the paste board, but only to the point where it's hanging on. So sometimes I like to describe this as Earth's atmosphere. You know, if this is the planet, this is Earth's atmosphere. Beyond the paste board, there's nothing you can do out there. You're going to lose the object, so it doesn't let you go out that far. But you can work out here. So I often, when I work, in order to not disrupt anything that's going on in here, I do a couple things out here, or I leave my some pieces out there. I often refer to them as file pieces, things that I'm just working on or using. But I always make sure that at the end, I clean that space up, especially if I'm saving something for production, because anything that's some rogue components or anything that's extraneous of our page can cause problems in the file that's writing for production. So it just means you're always trying to keep a tidy file. The other thing is, if any of you do get further into this creative work and you get into an agency or you're doing your own kind of work, it's very often that someone else will be opening and working on a file, whether it's because you're out sick or you're on vacation, or that file has to be passed on to a colleague and so on. So I always recommend just trying to really work as tidy as you can, because not only can glitches happen due to file clutter. A pain when you're trying to work with colleagues and they open a file and wonder what's going on, or you open a file that someone's worked on and you get a sense of the frustration because you don't know which logo you're supposed to be using because there's 6 out here and they're all different and so on. Okay, so that is a usable space. You just want to maintain it. Okay, so one of the things with InDesign, when you think of doing a layout, you're often bringing in components. We looked at some samples last week and we saw that a lot of them had what's called rules. So like long lines or rectangles, thin rectangles that were used to divide content. Some had color blocks, sections of color, and so on. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, how do I change the color of the background? Now, keeping on brand with Bell, you're going to keep things pretty simple. You're probably going to have a white background. You might have a light gray somewhere. You'll use the blue as a highlight to divide sections and so on. We'll see a bit of that. And then for the climate network, same thing. They have their colors, but they're otherwise pretty minimal. However, if you do want to change the background, I told you that when you look in your swatches palette, you'd see paper. So if I knew that this was going to be printed on a cream colored paper, then I would want to actually change this swatch to reflect as closely as I can the color of that cream colored paper that I knew this was going to be printed on. That way I can see what my design is going to look like on that paper. But that color that I did, and I'm going to do it here just so you can see. I'll be a little extreme here. So now I know I'm printing this on a yellow paper, and this is what the Bell logo would look like on a yellow paper. However, this would not print because InDesign understands it as being yellow. So there would be no printing happening with that color. It would be dependent on the color the paper being that actual color. I'm going to change that back. So to make a colored background, if I wanted a background that was, for example, a very light gray, I would go to my shape tools over here, and this can be a little confusing, so I'm going to explain it very quickly. Double my tools up here. Here you have one that looks like the shape tool, and this here it's named the rectangle tool, but we also call it the shape tool because if I hold it down, we have rectangle, ellipse, which is what we use, and the polygon tool, which you can create multi-side shapes with. So this is the one that you will want to be using. You do not want to be using the frame tool. And the frame tool, I still think, should be removed from InDesign because everything that the frame tool can do, the shape tool can do, and more. So it becomes a little bit deceiving because you think that if you're putting an image in, you have to use the frame tool and place an image into that. That's not the case. You can do that with shapes as well. So my recommendation, even though they're very much the same, is to avoid this tool right here. You should never really need it, and because you can do everything that you need to do with the shape tool. And we'll see an example of placing an image into a shape later. However, I'm going to take the rectangle and I'll make from bleed guide to bleed guide. So I'm going off the page, but this is a background that I'm going to make. I'll select that, and let's say I'm just going to choose an obvious color here, a bright color. But also, before I do that, I'm going to mention, remember when you're changing colors, I think we saw this last week, you have 3 right now indications of what colors are happening on that shape. That shape it has no fill, so here we can see fill and it's got that red stroke through it, so that means none. There's no fill on there. The outline or the stroke is white. So if I bring that off the page for a moment and I'll just zoom in, we can see that that is white. That's the stroke or the outline. So it's got the white stroke, no fill. We see that over in the bottom of our tools panel. We see that up top. Remember, you should be working in Essentials Classic. So this becomes our object panel when we have an object selected. We can see in the object panel we have the white stroke, and there's our swatches, and we have the no fill. There's none applied right now. So it's essentially 100% see-through. There's no color applied to the fill. And then we also see it in the color swatches themselves. So I was saying I want to make this a background. First thing I'm going to do, and I can do it any number of ways, but I'm going to activate the stroke here. I could have just selected it here and chosen none. I'm just working in my swatches panel, so I'll do it here. I activate that stroke by clicking it, bringing it forward of the fill swatch there, and then I'll click none. So I know that stroke is off. Right now the shape has no color at all, no outline applied, and no fill. It's just a frame, just a box. So to do the full background color, I'll activate the fill. That means a whole space inside that shape. and I'll click a color here. And nothing changed, only because I didn't actually select what I want to work on. So remember, you always want to tell it, we're working on this, and then you can change it. So I did that before. So now what's going to happen, I was actually setting this up as my default color because I clicked on it when nothing was selected. So I'm going to fix that. Now I'll select again the object I want to work on, and I've activated the fill. So it looks like it still has a white stroke there, so I'm going to turn that back. There we go. So no colors applied. Then I'll click on the fill. There we go. Now you'll see that it covered everything up. Our image is still there. It's back there, but I made the background the entire size. When you're working in these programs in InDesign and Illustrator specifically, it's essentially a stack of objects. Whatever you've brought in first is on the bottom, and as you build, you're building up and up. This logo lands somewhere in the middle. Even though it's not showing as being above or beneath something, if we were to turn this whole document onto its side, the image would be at the very bottom, the logo would be the next up, and then of course our background that we just created. So you need to know how to move things forward and backward. If any of you have worked in Photoshop, you may be tempted to use layers. But for the most part, you don't need to really use layers in InDesign and Illustrator unless you're working on things that are quite complicated, a little more complex. In much of my work, I have to use layers, and then in something like this, I wouldn't, because it just complicates things. So in order to move this to the back, I have a couple of options. I can go up to the Object menu and go Arrange, and I can send backward, which is one object at a time, or I can just send it right to the back. I always use these key commands just because I'm doing this often. But you know, you're new to this, so you can go up to the Object menu and go Arrange, or you can even just right click. And you have to have the object selected. Sometimes if you right click, you won't have any option because it has nothing to work with. So I select it, and then I go to right click, Arrange, and I'm going to send this to the back. I know I want it to be at the very back, so I'll send it completely to the back. So there's my background. And I can also, if I was keeping this as the background, I can also select it again, and I can lock that shape. Again, going to the Object menu and Lock or Command L, and that way I can work on top of it and it won't move around and it won't get misplaced accidentally. So you can lock objects, and then of course if you have an object locked, so I'll lock this, lock, and you'll see that it gets that little lock there. Might be difficult to see because it's behind our image, but I can click on that, and you can see my cursor just showing that little unlock sign, and that will unlock it. Or I could go up to the Object menu and unlock everything. So if I had multiple images that were locked and I went to unlock all, it would unlock anything that has been locked. Either way, at the moment, I don't want a background on this, so I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to just draw another shape. So going back to my rectangle tool, I'm going to do just a box beneath the header here. A little more subtle. And I need to color this. So again, I don't want a stroke. Very rarely do you actually want to apply a stroke to these objects. It's much cleaner artwork if you don't have outlines on everything. Most of you will have, by default, a stroke will come up on whatever you draw. That's when you'll want to go to activate the stroke and make sure you click none. I'm going to activate fill here, and I'm going to select the Pantone that came in with my logo, which is the Pantone that Bell uses as part of their brand, and it should fill that in that color. I'll go back to my main selection tool, click off, and let go of everything. I'll press W, my presentation mode, and I can see, okay, with all those frames going on, it looked like it was up against the image, so I'm just going to select that. I'm going to use my arrow key and bump that up so that it is touching. And it's okay to overlap by a bit. There we go. So you're always trying to work tidily, of course. I'll turn off presentation mode, press W. And I'm actually going to bring this logo back in here. And I'll put it to the margin. It's important content. The margin is a good space to keep it away from the image. I'm going to scale it up a little bit. One thing to remember, this is quite important when it comes to working with brand logos, with higher end brands, of course, but really any, even if it's you're doing your own business card, you want to try to avoid really large logos. There's a fine line between using a logo and having it seen and the logo being small enough that it's elegant but visible, and then so large that it just looks cheap. You know, if I did this on a newsletter and then I have titles and content and so on, that's going to look quite, it's going to look just not very elegant at all. Now, you'll notice that on this one, the logo is a little egg-shaped. I'm just going to check my Illustrator file. So somewhere along the line, I incorrectly scaled that. I probably did it while I was moving it to the outside. So I'm going to copy it again because I want to be sure that I have not skewed that logo. Remember our fatal errors lecture last week? I definitely don't want to make that error. So I'm going to delete this one, paste again. Okay, good. So that confirms the logo's okay. Put it there, and the size works out okay. So it's not too big, it's not too small. You know, again, you go too small. I'm holding my shift key down when I scale this. You know, like that. That doesn't have very much presence. The first thing your client's going to say is, can you make our logo a little bigger? So we can make it bigger where it's suitable to the page, but at the same time it's not so big that it's ridiculous. Most clients want their logo bigger. No matter the size you make it, they want it even larger. That's just, it's one of those graphic design mysteries. If you're working with a client's logo, they always want it larger. So sometimes it takes a little bit of educating the client, just explaining why a little smaller is actually more elegant and shows a little more confidence. Okay, so we've got the logo there, and I'm just going to draw a rule. So I'm going to go back to my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to draw a rule under the logo there, and you can see how the guides help me line that up. And I'll color this a light gray. So I'm going to go back to my swatches, make sure my fill swatch is activated, it's in front, and I'll click black. And using black in InDesign can be a little deceiving because you see two black swatches here. Registration is a different color code. So it's used for what's called those administrative items that will be around the page when you write a PDF or something. That's not, you have to look at that as though it's not the color black. We saw in the samples that we looked at last week that had the crop marks in the corners. Those are done in the color of registration. The program itself writes them and uses that. If we were creating our own registration marks, we would use that. So if you want something black or a light gray and so on, use the true black, and you'll see it has the CMYK here. This symbol, it shows that it would print on what's called plates. I'm not going to get into that, but it's just for administrative items, nothing that would actually be showing in the finished printed, cut and folded piece. So I'm going to select black here, but then I'm going to use the tint, and I'm going to back that off to about 20 or so. I'll press W again. And you can see, without even noticing it, I do it without trying anymore. I deselected, I clicked off, and that's, again, just habit. So there's a rule. I'm keeping it away from the logo. The logo has what's called plenty of clear space around it. And I'm keeping it away from that, but it's giving some emphasis to the logo. It's in a way grounding it in this space. So I'll press W again. And then I'm going to make another shape. I'm going to start defining some sections in this area. So I may have had a sketch. I didn't, but I'm just going out of my head. I may have had a sketch that helps me define the area of my newsletter, of this page, of this layout. So I'm kind of looking at the image. Remember in the first lecture we talked about how images have defining lines. Here's a line that kind of works well for the placement of the logo. These lead our eye to the logo. So if I want to do maybe a sidebar section on this, I'm going to make another rectangle. I'm just going to make it here. It doesn't matter where. And remembering that as you're drawing something, you can move it as you draw it by holding that space bar down. So I'm drawing freehand with my mouse. I'll hold the space bar. I can move it into place a bit, let go, keep drawing, move it, let go. So I'm going to bring this down to my bleed guide. And what I'm doing is I'm finding that I can almost use this part, the line between their faces or the front of his face, as a section as a way of defining a section. So that's why I placed it there. It becomes instinct. Sometimes you kind of have to look for it, but you'll find the more you do this kind of work, you instinctively begin to see those positions for placing things. So I'm just going to clean this up a bit. It's overlapping a little, but I've used a gray here that I actually like. I would like to use that for my sidebar. I know that it's a 20% tint of black, but I'm going to actually sample that color. And I'm going to show you color sampling, which is quite useful. When we work with layouts, often if we have the flexibility with color, when we don't have a strict color palette, for like Bell has a very strict color palette, so we won't be bringing much color into a Bell newsletter, aside from black, gray, and their Pantone blue. However, if you have a little more freedom, what we do often is create some unity between the image and other design elements by sampling color out of that image. So InDesign can be a little annoying in this way. It's annoying in a lot of ways, but in this way we have to first go set our sample tool. So I'm going to go over here to this tool, and you'll see it called the Color Theme tool. I'm going to hold that down, and I'm going to go to what's called the eyedropper. Now I call it sampling, but the tool is called an eyedropper. So I'll click on that, getting it ready. And we'll see in tutorials ahead how we can use the eyedropper for different things. It samples text formatting, it samples color, and so on. It samples object attributes as well. So I've selected that. I'm going to go back to if I didn't have this selected, I would go back to my selection tool. So having set that tool, and make sure that I select whatever I want to work on. And in this case, I'm selecting this sidebar because I want to sample the attributes of this rule to apply to that. So I'll click on my sampler, and I'll click on that, and it will apply the same fill and stroke, which is a light gray fill and no stroke, no outline, to that. Now I'll go back, make sure I go back to my selection tool, go back to my sidebar. It's selected, so I'll right click, arrange, send to back. So that I went through pretty quickly, but you can rewind 30 seconds and watch again if you want. But that's the process that you often go through. You're drawing, you like what you have here, so you sample it. Now if I wanted to sample a color out of my image, I would do it the same thing. Select what I want to apply that color to. So whatever I want to change, I have to have selected. I select the eyedropper, click on the image. So I'm going to look for maybe the brightest green I can find in here. So probably around in here somewhere. I'll click that. And because I had the fill selected on that object, it changed that the color of that to match the green. There's not a whole lot of green in there, so I'm going to select another color from there that's more dominant. Now the thing is, InDesign is annoying, like I said, so I can click and it's showing me that the eyedropper is actually full. It's done. So I have to go back, click it again for an unknown reason, and it's empty, and now I can select another color from that image. And you might see just that change, just selecting that, changing the color of this object to a color from within the image creates a lot of optical unity across the layout. It's a really helpful way to bring unity into your layout and to make sure the eye is traveling nicely through. And you'll see even here, this works out well because we've defined somewhat of a section between the window pillars and the logo, their faces and this section, and I could get even more picky and play off of this shadow and change the size of that to match the shadow on his arm. So now we know wherever we come in, we're kind of defining, our eyes are defining the sections of this layout. Press W again. So obviously, again, this is a bell layout. We're not going to bring in really any color beyond their colors, so I'm going to change this back to that gray, that 20% black. I could do it here. I could click on black and change the tint, but I'm going to use my sample tool and just select on this one. There we go. I'll go back to my selection tool. Okay, so that adds in that sidebar. This might be a little heavy on the gray over here. I made it the same as that, but a smaller object will show a little less intense than a large object in the same tint. So I'm actually going to change this a bit. I'm going to click on it, go back up to my tint in my swatches, and I'll just pull that back to maybe 10%. That's a little more gentle on the page. Okay, now, one thing I hear quite often is how to make rounded corners on shapes. So I'm going to go back to my shape tool, and I'm going to make a square. So this is called the rectangle tool. But to make a square, you might be able to guess that you would hold the Shift key down while you draw it. So I hold Shift, click and drag, and it's going to make a square. If I wanted to move this into place, as I draw it, again, I'm still holding Shift. I'm going to add the space bar in there. I'll move that up. I'm going to move it up here. So I'll try and get it about 1/2 inch from this edge over here so that it's matching up with that guide. So I can adjust it later, but I'll see if I can get it there. So it's pretty close. So I let go of my mouse before I let go of the Shift key so that the mouse says we're done. And then you let go of the Shift key and it says, okay, we don't have to hang on to this as a square anymore. And then I'll click on making sure my fill is activated. I'll click on the Pantone color there, and I'll just click off for a moment. Okay, so I'll press W again. We're going to make one of these corners rounded in the end, but I'm going to talk about a couple of things here first. When you have an object like this that's, you know, it's the same color as this header. This would be called the base of our image header. You can combine shapes into a single shape. So if I select this square, hold Shift, and select this part of the header, I have them both selected. I can make those so that it's one clean shape that's shaped like that. Usually that's not necessary. In logo design and working with Illustrator, you do that quite a lot. But I get asked if it can be done, so I'm just going to show you. You would go to the Object menu, and you would go down to Pathfinder. And we're going to see this in Illustrator later on, how this is a little easier and more in-depth in Illustrator, but I'm going to add the two together. And you'll see that that turns them into a single shape. That's one weird shape right now. So anything I do will happen to all of that. I'm going to keep them separate though. I'm just Command-Zetting my way back to where they're separate. And I keep them separate because I might want to move this a little bit. I might want to make adjustments that will just be easier. Now when I want to round part of this, the way to do that is to click on this yellow box. So this is the corner activator. So you can see it says click to edit corners. So I'll click that, and it brings up these diamonds on the corners. So if I drag one of them, any one of them, it will change all four corners. In this case, I just want to do one corner. So I'm going to hold my Shift key down and then click and drag that corner. If I wanted to do two, I would have to do them separately. And that looks a little funny, so I'm just going to leave it at the single corner. And you know, doing something like this subtly is it's helpful in a layout, especially a minimal layout like this. When you just round a corner like that, it lends a little bit of appeal. The reason I did this corner and the amount I did it, I'm actually going to pull it back a little bit, is it's a couple things. Again, I would never expect you guys to see these things right away, but I'm going to explain them because they're here, and it's fun to analyze design this way. The reason I did this outside corner is because we're always trying to keep the viewer's eye in our layout rather than taking them out of the layout. So for example, the couple here, they're facing in from pretty much the right side. So where they're looking, we tend to look. So we're looking into our layout. Same thing here. This curve is bending inward. So if our eye comes over here, without realizing it, of course, our eyes will kind of flow back into the layout. If I did the opposing corner like that, then you can see our eye starts to go out of the layout. Well, we don't want that. There's going to be stuff here for them to read, so we want to keep them in there. So I'll go back where it's there. Now the other thing is the amount that I did this, I'm basing it on something that is relevant to the brand, and of course in this case it's the logo. So a dominant aspect in this logo is the happy face. It's really what we see when we look at this, because it's a face. Even though it's very basic, it's eyes and a mouth, that's what we notice as the dominant factor of that logo. So I based the amount I did this curve on what I'm seeing, the kind of curvature of that logo. If I brought this over, I'll just bring it in front for a moment, it would be pretty close, a little bigger, but it's just playing off that curve. So I could adjust it to be a little smaller, but with distance, it almost looks about right. So that's what I was playing this curve off. off of how this feels. So again, I'm maintaining the optical flow into the document, but I'm also seeing a shape that I can play off of with that rounded corner. If I went too big with that rounded corner, it's kind of awkward. It's immediately awkward. It's not playing off anything. It almost looks like something that just doesn't belong in this brand space. So I'll undo that. Now if I went too small, it doesn't really do anything. It almost has a what's the point sort of curve to it. So again, a lot of this is instinctive. However, you get used to it and you start to understand what cues to look for. You know, if I'm going to bring a section in here, what can I see in another part of the layout that can help me determine a good size for that section? And if I want to round a corner, what cues in the layout or in the brand components can I play off of to do that? Now remember also what I showed you last week in regard to the direct select. Remember that direct select, the white cursor next to our main one, allows us to adjust something by the points, the anchor points. So if I go over here, I select the line that is activating. These are white, so none of them are selected right now, but they're all activated. And I can move this line, or I can move just that point. If I hold shift while I do it, it'll stay in line. So we can adjust shapes to pretty much anything we want. We just have to know which of these tools we want to use. And of course, that comes with experience, time, and definitely asking if you're unsure.